Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of person who turned heads when she walked into a room. At 25, she worked as a flight attendant for a major airline, her bright smile and confident demeanor making passengers feel at ease during their journeys. Her long dark hair caught the light perfectly, and her warm brown eyes sparkled with an infectious joy that seemed to brighten even the gloomiest days. On a crisp October morning, Sarah was driving to the airport for what should have been a routine flight to Chicago. She had made this drive hundreds of times before, navigating the familiar streets with practiced ease while listening to her favorite morning radio show. The hosts were discussing weekend plans, and Sarah found herself smiling as she thought about her own upcoming plans with her fiancé, Michael. The intersection of 5th and Main Street looked clear as Sarah approached. The traffic light had just turned green, and she pressed gently on the accelerator, her mind already shifting to the day ahead. She was thinking about the new safety demonstration she had been practicing when everything changed in an instant. A delivery truck, running late for its morning route, came barreling through the red light from the opposite direction. The driver had been checking his GPS, momentarily distracted by the unfamiliar route his supervisor had assigned him that morning. By the time he looked up and saw Sarah's small sedan in the intersection, it was far too late to stop. The impact was devastating. The truck's front end crashed directly into the driver's side of Sarah's car, sending her vehicle spinning across the intersection like a child's toy. The sound of crushing metal and shattering glass echoed through the morning air, causing pedestrians to stop in horror and other drivers to slam on their brakes. Sarah's world went black immediately. When the paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, they found her unconscious and trapped in the mangled remains of her car. The driver's side was completely crushed inward, and it took the fire department nearly an hour to carefully extract her from the wreckage. Throughout the rescue operation, Sarah remained unconscious, her body broken but still fighting. The ambulance ride to Memorial Hospital was a blur of sirens and urgent voices. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of the paramedics' conversations about her condition. Words like severe trauma, facial injuries, and emergency surgery floated through her foggy awareness, but she couldn't quite grasp their meaning. Dr. Elizabeth Chen was the plastic surgeon on call that morning when Sarah arrived at the emergency room. She had seen countless accident victims throughout her 15-year career, but the extent of Sarah's facial injuries was among the most severe she had encountered. The left side of Sarah's face had taken the brunt of the impact, with deep lacerations running from her temple down to her jawline. The emergency room team worked frantically to stabilize Sarah's condition. She had suffered a concussion, several broken ribs, and extensive damage to her left arm, but it was the facial trauma that would prove to be the most challenging. Shards of glass had embedded themselves deeply into her skin, and the force of the impact had torn through muscle and tissue in ways that would require multiple surgeries to repair. Michael received the phone call while he was in a meeting at his law firm downtown. The hospital representative's voice was calm but serious as she explained that Sarah had been in an accident and that he should come to the hospital immediately. The 20-minute drive felt like hours as Michael's mind raced with worst-case scenarios, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When Michael first saw Sarah in the intensive care unit, he barely recognized the woman he had planned to marry in just 6 months. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in bandages that couldn't completely hide the severity of her injuries. Machines beeped steadily around her bed, monitoring her vital signs as she lay unconscious, looking fragile and small beneath the white hospital sheets. Dr. Chen met with Michael and Sarah's parents, explaining the extent of the damage and the long road ahead. The facial injuries were complex, she explained, involving not just the skin but also underlying muscle and nerve damage. While they could repair much of the damage through a series of surgeries, there would likely be permanent scarring, particularly on the left side of her face. Sarah remained in a medically induced coma for 5 days, while the swelling in her brain reduced and her other injuries began to stabilize. During this time, Michael never left her side, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair and talking to her unconscious form, believing somehow that his voice might help guide her back to consciousness. When Sarah finally woke up, her first sensation was pain. A deep throbbing pain that seemed to emanate from the left side of her face and radiate throughout her entire head. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw from the breathing tube that had been removed just hours earlier. Her first word was a whispered "Michael," and his relief was overwhelming as he gently took her hand. The next few days were a blur of doctor visits, pain medication, and slowly coming to terms with what had happened. Sarah's memory of the accident itself remained foggy, but the physical reality of her situation became clearer with each passing day. She could feel the bandages covering the left side of her face, and the way the nurses' expressions changed when they looked at her told her everything she needed to know. About the severity of her injuries, Dr. Chen was honest, but gentle when she explained the extent of the facial trauma. The scarring would be significant, she said, running in jagged lines from Sarah's temple down to her jaw. While plastic surgery could improve the appearance somewhat, the scarring would be permanent and quite visible. Sarah listened in stunned silence, her good hand unconsciously moving toward the bandages covering the damaged side of her face. The woman who had always been confident about her appearance, who had made her living partly based on her professional image, now faced a future where she would forever bear the visible marks of that terrible October morning. As she lay in that hospital bed, surrounded by flowers and get-well cards from friends and colleagues, Sarah had no idea that her real challenges were just beginning. 3 weeks after the accident, Sarah finally looked at herself in a mirror for the first time. Michael had been gently encouraging her to take this step, believing it would help her begin to accept her new reality. The nurses had removed most of the bandages the day before, leaving only small protective strips over the deepest cuts. Nothing could have prepared Sarah for what she saw reflected back at her. The left side of her face was a roadmap of angry red scars, some thick and raised, others thin and jagged. The largest scar ran from just above her left eyebrow down to the corner of her mouth, creating a permanent line that pulled slightly at her lip. Smaller scars branched off from this main line like tributaries of a river, creating a complex pattern of damaged skin that would never fully heal. Sarah's first reaction was to turn away from the mirror, but something made her look again. She studied each scar carefully, tracing their paths with her eyes while trying to reconcile this new face with the woman she remembered being. The scars were not just marks on her skin. They represented a fundamental change in how the world would see her and how she would see herself. The physical therapy sessions began 2 weeks later. Sarah's left arm had been badly damaged in the accident, and the muscles in her face needed work to regain full mobility. The facial exercises were particularly challenging, both physically and emotionally. Each movement reminded her of how different she looked now, how the scars pulled and twisted her expressions in ways that felt foreign and uncomfortable. Maria Santos, her physical therapist, was a small woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense attitude and surprising strength. She had worked with trauma patients for over 20 years and had seen how physical recovery was often tied directly to emotional acceptance. She pushed Sarah hard during their sessions, but always with encouragement and understanding. The exercises for Sarah's face involved stretching and strengthening the damaged muscles. She had to practice smiling, frowning, and making various expressions while Maria monitored her progress. The scarred tissue was tight and resistant, making even simple expressions feel strange and sometimes painful. Sarah would often become frustrated during these sessions, especially when she caught glimpses of herself in the therapy room's mirrors. Michael remained supportive throughout Sarah's recovery, but even he struggled with the dramatic change in her appearance. He loved Sarah deeply and was committed to their relationship, but he couldn't deny that he sometimes found it difficult to look directly at the scarred side of her face. He felt guilty about this reaction and worked hard to hide it, but Sarah was perceptive enough to notice his subtle changes in behavior. The couple's wedding plans, which had been set for the following spring, were quietly postponed. Michael suggested they wait until Sarah felt more confident about her appearance, perhaps after additional plastic surgery. Sarah agreed, though part of her wondered if Michael was having second thoughts about marrying someone who looked so different from the woman he had proposed to. Sarah's return to work was another major challenge. The airline had been supportive during her recovery, holding her position and providing excellent medical benefits. However, the nature of her job as a flight attendant meant that her appearance was part of her professional qualifications. The airline industry, while officially promoting diversity and inclusion, still maintained certain appearance standards for customer-facing employees. When Sarah met with her supervisor, Janet Morrison, 6 weeks after the accident, the conversation was awkward and painful. Janet was a kind woman who genuinely cared about her employees, but she also had to consider the practical realities of the airline business. She gently explained that while Sarah's position was secure, she might need to consider transitioning to a role that didn't involve direct customer interaction. The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. Being a flight attendant wasn't just her job. It was her identity. She loved traveling, meeting new people, and helping passengers feel comfortable during their flights. The idea of being hidden away in some back-office position, because her appearance might make customers uncomfortable, was devastating. Dr. Chen continued to monitor Sarah's healing progress and discussed options for additional plastic surgery. She explained that while they could improve the appearance of some scars, others would always be visible. The main scar running down the left side of Sarah's face was particularly deep and would likely remain prominent. Despite any future procedures, Sarah spent hours researching scar treatments and cosmetic procedures online. She learned about laser therapy, skin grafts, and advanced surgical techniques that might help minimize her scar's appearance. However, the more she researched, the more she realized that no treatment could completely erase what had happened to her face. The psychological impact of her changed appearance began to manifest in various ways. Sarah started avoiding social situations, especially those involving people who had known her before the accident. She couldn't bear to see the shock and pity in their eyes when they first saw her scars. Even simple activities like grocery shopping became difficult, as she became hyper-aware of people staring at her. Sarah began wearing her hair in styles that covered as much of the scarred side of her face as possible. She experimented with makeup techniques designed to camouflage scars, spending hours each morning trying to create the illusion of unblemished skin. While these efforts helped somewhat, they couldn't completely hide the damage, and the daily routine of concealment became exhausting. Michael suggested they attend couples counseling to help them navigate this difficult period. The therapist, Dr. Robert Kim, specialized in helping couples deal with traumatic life changes. During their sessions, Michael was able to express his conflicted feelings about Sarah's changed appearance, while Sarah shared her fears about their future together. The counseling sessions revealed deep issues that neither Sarah nor Michael had fully acknowledged. Sarah's entire sense of self-worth had been tied to her physical appearance, while Michael realized he had been more superficial in his affections than he had previously admitted. These realizations were painful but necessary for both of them to understand their path forward. Friends and family members struggled with how to interact with Sarah. Some people tried to act as if nothing had changed, which felt false and uncomfortable. Others focused so much on her scars that every conversation became about her injuries and recovery. Sarah longed for the natural, easy interactions she had enjoyed before the accident, but those seemed to be a thing of the past. As the months passed, Sarah began to understand that her recovery would involve much more than just physical healing. She would need to rebuild her entire sense of identity and find new ways to navigate a world that had become infinitely more challenging. The woman who had once walked confidently through life would need to find a different kind of strength to face each new day. 6 months after the accident, Sarah finally agreed to attend her best friend Jessica's birthday party. It would be her first social gathering since the crash, and the thought of facing so many people who had known her before filled her with anxiety. She spent 3 hours getting ready, carefully arranging her hair to cover the worst of the scarring and applying layers of concealing makeup. The party was being held at Jessica's apartment, a cozy space that Sarah had visited dozens of times before. As she stood outside the familiar door, her hand raised to knock, Sarah almost turned around and left. Only Michael's gentle encouragement and her own determination to reclaim some normalcy in her life gave her the courage to finally announce their arrival. Jessica answered the door with her characteristic enthusiasm. But Sarah caught the brief moment of shock that crossed her friend's face before the warm smile appeared. Jessica had visited Sarah in the hospital and during her early recovery, but seeing her in a social setting somehow made the changes more stark and permanent. The party was in full swing when they arrived, with about 20 people scattered throughout the apartment. Sarah recognized most of the faces from their college days and various social gatherings over the years. As she and Michael made their way into the room, conversations gradually died down as people noticed her presence. Sarah had prepared herself for stares and awkward moments, but the reality was still difficult to bear. She watched people's expressions change as they registered the extensive scarring on the left side of her face. Some tried to maintain normal eye contact while others couldn't help but glance repeatedly at her scars. A few people simply looked away altogether, focusing intently on their drinks or finding sudden interest in other conversations. David Chen, a mutual friend from college, approached them with what seemed like genuine warmth. He had always been known for his directness, and Sarah appreciated that he acknowledged her changed appearance, without making it the entire focus of their conversation. He asked about her recovery and listened attentively to her responses, treating her like the same person she had always been. However, not everyone was as tactful. Sarah overheard whispered conversations near the kitchen, where people were discussing her appearance in hushed tones. Words like terrible, tragic, and never be the same drifted over to her, each one feeling like a small dagger to her already fragile self-esteem. The evening's most challenging moment came when someone suggested taking group photos to commemorate Jessica's birthday. Sarah's immediate instinct was to decline, but Jessica insisted that the photos wouldn't be the same without her. As they arranged themselves for the pictures, Sarah positioned herself carefully to keep the scarred side of her face turned away from the camera. Robert Martinez, one of their old college friends who had clearly had too much to drink, decided that Sarah's positioning wasn't working for the group composition. Without thinking about the consequences of his actions, he reached over and gently turned Sarah's face toward the camera, saying, "Come on, Sarah, don't be shy. Let's see that beautiful smile." The movement exposed the full extent of Sarah's scarring to everyone present and to the camera. The room fell silent as people saw, many for the first time, the complete picture of how the accident had changed her appearance. The main scar running from her temple to her jaw was fully visible, along with the network of smaller scars that surrounded it. Sarah felt exposed and vulnerable in a way she had never experienced before. The careful positioning she had maintained all evening was gone, and she was suddenly on display for everyone to see. Her instinct was to cover her face with her hands or to turn away, but she found herself frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The photographer, unaware of the social dynamics at play, continued taking pictures, capturing Sarah's expression of shock and vulnerability. The camera flashes seemed unusually bright, and Sarah felt as though each one was highlighting her scars for everyone to study and remember. Michael immediately stepped forward, placing his arm protectively around Sarah and suggesting they move to a different area of the room. His intervention broke the uncomfortable silence, and people began talking again, though the atmosphere had noticeably changed. The easy, celebratory mood of the party had been replaced by an awkward tension that everyone could feel, but no one quite knew how to address. Jessica quickly approached Sarah, apologizing profusely for Robert's thoughtless action and for the uncomfortable situation. She offered to delete the photos, but Sarah knew that the damage had already been done. Everyone had seen her scars clearly, and no amount of photo deletion could erase that moment of exposure. Sarah excused herself to the bathroom, needing a few minutes alone to compose herself. She stared at her reflection in Jessica's bathroom mirror, seeing herself through the eyes of everyone at the party. The makeup had held up reasonably well, but under the bright bathroom lights, every scar was clearly visible. When she returned to the party, Sarah noticed that people were treating her differently. Some seemed to be making an extra effort to include her in conversations, their kindness feeling forced and uncomfortable. Others appeared to be avoiding her altogether, perhaps unsure of how to act now that they had seen the full extent of her injuries. The remainder of the evening passed slowly. Sarah participated in conversations and tried to maintain a positive attitude, but she felt fundamentally changed by what had happened. The careful image management she had worked so hard to maintain had been stripped away in an instant, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. When they finally said their goodbyes and left the party, Sarah and Michael drove home in relative silence. Michael tried to reassure her that the evening hadn't been as bad as she thought, but Sarah knew better. She had seen the looks, heard the whispers, and felt the shift in how people related to her. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about the evening's events. The moment when Robert had turned her face toward the camera played over and over in her mind. She realized that no amount of makeup or strategic hairstyling could completely hide who she had become. The accident had changed more than just her appearance. It had changed how the world saw her and how she moved through social spaces. The next morning, Sarah made a difficult decision. She called Jessica to thank her for the invitation, but also to ask that the photos from the evening not be shared on social media or with other friends. Jessica readily agreed, understanding the sensitivity of the situation. Sarah also realized that she needed to develop a different approach to social situations. Trying to hide her scars was exhausting and ultimately futile. She would need to find a way to be comfortable with her changed appearance if she wanted to reclaim any semblance of her former social life. The birthday party had been a harsh lesson in how the world had changed for her, but it had also been a necessary step in understanding what her new reality would require. Sarah began to think about whether she was strong enough to face that reality, or if she would spend the rest of her life trying to hide from it. 8 months after the accident, Sarah received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel James Patterson, a retired military officer who now worked with a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping trauma survivors. He had heard about Sarah's case through Dr. Chen, who volunteered with the organization and thought Sarah might benefit from their services. Colonel Patterson had a distinctive voice, gravelly and authoritative, shaped by 30 years of military service. He explained that he specialized in working with people who had suffered life-changing injuries, particularly those involving visible disfigurement. He had worked with wounded veterans, burn victims, and civilians who had experienced traumatic accidents similar to Sarah's. Sarah was initially hesitant to meet with another counselor or support person. She had grown tired of well-meaning people who wanted to help her accept her new reality or find peace with her changed appearance. However, something in Colonel Patterson's straightforward manner appealed to her. He didn't speak in the gentle, careful tones that most people used with her now. Instead, he talked to her like she was a capable adult who could handle direct conversation. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where Sarah might feel more comfortable. Colonel Patterson suggested they sit outside if the weather was nice, mentioning that he found outdoor conversations more natural and relaxed. Sarah agreed, though she worried about having their discussion in such a public setting. On the day of their meeting, Sarah spent her usual hour getting ready, carefully applying makeup and arranging her hair to minimize the visibility of her scars. She arrived at the coffee shop a few minutes early and chose a table on the patio where she could position herself with the scarred side of her face turned away from most of the other patrons. Colonel Patterson arrived precisely on time. A tall man in his early 60s with silver hair and an erect posture that spoke of his military background. He wore a simple polo shirt and khakis, but there was something about his bearing that commanded respect. As he approached Sarah's table, she noticed he walked with a slight limp, though he moved with confidence and purpose. What struck Sarah immediately was how Colonel Patterson looked directly at her when they were introduced. Most people, even those who knew about her scars, had difficulty maintaining normal eye contact. They would look at her briefly, then their gaze would shift away, often focusing on a point just past her shoulder or down at their hands. Colonel Patterson looked directly into her eyes and kept his focus there throughout their introduction. They ordered coffee and began talking about Sarah's recovery process. Colonel Patterson asked detailed questions about her physical therapy, her emotional state, and her plans for returning to work. His questions were direct and practical, focusing on concrete aspects of her situation rather than abstract concepts about acceptance and healing. As their conversation progressed, Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. Colonel Patterson's straightforward approach was refreshing after months of careful, tiptoeing conversations with family and friends. He treated her like someone who was dealing with a difficult situation, rather than like a fragile victim who needed to be handled with extreme care. About 30 minutes into their meeting, a strong gust of wind swept across the patio. Sarah had been sitting with her left side turned away from Colonel Patterson, but the wind caught her hair and blew it back, fully exposing the scarred side of her face. Her immediate reaction was to reach up and smooth her hair back into place, but she noticed something remarkable in that moment. Colonel Patterson's gaze never wavered. He continued looking directly at her, maintaining the same level of eye contact and attention he had shown throughout their conversation. There was no shock, no pity, no uncomfortable shifting of focus. He simply continued talking as if nothing had happened, as if the wind revealing her scars was no more significant than if it had blown a napkin off their table. This reaction was so different from what Sarah had experienced with others that she found herself studying Colonel Patterson's face more carefully. It was then that she noticed something she had missed during their initial introduction. There was a thin, pale line running along the right side of his jaw, barely visible but definitely present. It was clearly an old scar, well healed but permanent. As if reading her thoughts, Colonel Patterson casually mentioned that he had been injured by shrapnel during his second tour in Afghanistan 15 years earlier. The injury had required multiple surgeries and had left him with permanent scarring along his jaw and neck. He spoke about it matter-of-factly without drama or self-pity, simply as part of his personal history. Sarah found herself asking about his experience with visible scarring, and Colonel Patterson shared some of his own challenges. He talked about the initial difficulty of returning to civilian life with changed appearance, the way people treated him differently, and the process of learning to navigate social situations with visible reminders of trauma. However, Colonel Patterson's perspective was markedly different from what Sarah had been hearing from her counselors and support groups. He didn't focus on acceptance or coming to terms with his scars. Instead, he talked about them as part of his story, evidence of experiences that had shaped him but didn't define his entire identity. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Colonel Patterson mentioned that he had noticed Sarah's careful positioning at their table. He gently suggested that she might be more comfortable if she stopped trying to hide her scars during their conversation. His tone was not critical but practical, like a coach offering tactical advice. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then made a conscious decision to turn slightly in her chair so that Colonel Patterson could see the full extent of her facial scarring. It was the first time since the accident that she had deliberately exposed her scars to someone new, and she waited anxiously for his reaction. Colonel Patterson's response was everything Sarah had hoped for, but hadn't expected to find. He looked at her scars with the same calm attention he had shown throughout their conversation. There was no grimace, no intake of breath, no look of pity or shock. He simply nodded and continued talking about practical strategies for dealing with public reactions to visible differences. What happened next was something Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Colonel Patterson was in the middle of explaining a technique for handling stares from strangers when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His face went pale, and he looked away from Sarah for the first time since they had begun talking. Sarah followed his gaze and saw what had captured his attention. A young woman at a nearby table had been badly burned in what appeared to be a recent accident. Her injuries were extensive, covering much of her face and hands, and she was clearly still in the early stages of recovery. She was sitting alone, carefully positioned to minimize others' view of her injuries. For several long seconds, Colonel Patterson was unable to look directly at the burned woman. His usual composed demeanor faltered, and Sarah could see him struggling with emotions that he was trying to control. When he finally turned back to Sarah, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that hadn't been there before. In that moment, Sarah understood something profound about courage and human connection. Colonel Patterson, who had seemed unshakable in his ability to look directly at her scars, had his own limits and triggers. The sight of the young burn victim had affected him in a way that Sarah's automotive scars had not. This revelation was both humbling and empowering for Sarah. She realized that everyone, even someone as seemingly strong as Colonel Patterson, had particular types of suffering that they found difficult to witness. His inability to look directly at the burn victim didn't make him weak or hypocritical. It made him human. The moment when Colonel Patterson looked away from the burn victim became a turning point in Sarah's understanding of human nature and her own journey. After he regained his composure, Colonel Patterson was honest about his reaction. He explained that burn injuries triggered memories from his military service that he had never fully processed, memories of fellow soldiers who had suffered in ways that still haunted him. This admission from someone she had viewed as unshakably strong gave Sarah a new perspective on her own situation. She began to understand that everyone carried invisible wounds and that visible scars were just one way that human suffering manifested itself. Colonel Patterson's moment of vulnerability made him more relatable, and their conversation more meaningful. They continued meeting weekly for the next 2 months. During these sessions, Colonel Patterson helped Sarah develop practical strategies for dealing with the social challenges her scars created. He taught her techniques for maintaining confidence during difficult encounters, and ways to redirect conversations. When people became too focused on her appearance, one of the most valuable lessons Colonel Patterson shared was the concept of controlling the narrative. He explained that Sarah could choose how to present her story rather than allowing others to make assumptions or create their own versions of what had happened to her. By being direct about her accident and recovery, she could often defuse people's curiosity and move conversations in more productive directions. Sarah began practicing these techniques in low-stakes situations. She started with brief interactions at stores and restaurants, gradually working up to longer conversations with acquaintances and coworkers. Each successful interaction built her confidence and helped her develop a more natural way of being in the world with her changed appearance. The relationship between Sarah and Michael also began to evolve. During this period, the couple's counseling sessions with Dr. Kim continued, and both of them were making progress in understanding how the accident had affected their relationship. Michael was learning to examine his own preconceptions about appearance and attraction, while Sarah was developing a stronger sense of self-worth that wasn't entirely dependent on how others saw her. Michael's family had struggled with Sarah's changed appearance, particularly his mother, who had always been concerned with social appearances and family image. His mother's subtle but persistent suggestions that perhaps Sarah should consider more extensive plastic surgery created tension in their relationship. Michael found himself caught between his loyalty to Sarah and his family's expectations. This family dynamic came to a head during a dinner at Michael's parents' house. His mother, Patricia, had invited several family friends without warning Sarah or Michael. When they arrived, Sarah realized she was being put on display, subjected to curious stares and carefully worded questions about her recovery and future plans. The evening was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Patricia's friends tried to be polite, but their discomfort was obvious. Some asked intrusive questions about plastic surgery options, while others made awkward comments about how brave Sarah was for going out in public. Sarah felt like an exhibit in a museum, rather than a guest at a family dinner. The situation reached its breaking point when one of Patricia's friends, a woman named Ellen who had clearly had extensive cosmetic work done herself, suggested that Sarah should consider going to her plastic surgeon. Ellen was insistent that modern techniques could fix Sarah's scars and restore her to something closer to her original appearance. Sarah had heard similar suggestions countless times since her accident, but something about Ellen's approach particularly bothered her. The implication that she needed to be fixed in order to be acceptable in polite society was offensive and hurtful. For the first time since her accident, Sarah found herself feeling angry rather than ashamed about her appearance. Michael watched as Sarah struggled with Ellen's comments and his mother's obvious agreement with the suggestion. He could see Sarah's distress, but he also felt pressure from his family to encourage her to pursue more aggressive treatment options. His hesitation to immediately defend Sarah was visible to everyone at the table. Sarah excused herself from the dinner, claiming she wasn't feeling well. Michael drove her home in tense silence, both of them aware that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship during that evening. Sarah realized that Michael was not entirely comfortable with her appearance and that his family would never fully accept her as she was. This realization led to several difficult conversations between Sarah and Michael about their future together. They both loved each other, but they had to acknowledge that the accident had changed not just Sarah's appearance, but the entire dynamic of their relationship. Michael admitted that he sometimes struggled with physical attraction, while Sarah confessed that she no longer felt like the confident woman he had fallen in love with. After much discussion and additional counseling sessions, Sarah and Michael made the difficult decision to end their engagement. The decision was mutual and handled with as much love and respect as possible, but it was still devastating for both of them. They recognized that they were not the same people they had been before the accident, and that their relationship could not simply return to what it had been. The end of her engagement was initially crushing for Sarah, but it also represented a kind of freedom. She no longer felt the pressure to minimize her scars for Michael's comfort, or to navigate his family's expectations about her appearance. For the first time since the accident, she could focus entirely on her own healing and growth, without considering how her choices affected someone else's comfort level. Sarah's relationship with her work also began to evolve during this period. The airline had offered her several different positions that would keep her employed, but out of direct customer contact. While these offers were generous, Sarah began to question whether she wanted to spend her career hidden away because of her appearance. She started researching other career options that might allow her to use her skills and experience in more meaningful ways. Through her work with Colonel Patterson's organization, she had met other trauma survivors and had discovered that she had a natural ability to connect with people who were struggling with visible differences. Sarah began volunteering with the nonprofit organization, helping newly injured people navigate the early stages of recovery and adjustment. She found this work deeply fulfilling, and her own experience with facial trauma made her uniquely qualified to understand what these individuals were going through. The volunteer work also helped Sarah develop a different relationship with her scars. Instead of seeing them only as evidence of trauma and loss, she began to view them as proof of survival and resilience. Her scars became part of her story rather than the entire definition of who she was. This shift in perspective didn't happen overnight, and Sarah still had difficult days when she struggled with self-consciousness and sadness about her changed appearance. However, she was developing the tools and support system necessary to handle these challenges without being overwhelmed by them. Colonel Patterson continued to be an important mentor and friend throughout this period. His own journey with visible scarring provided a roadmap for how Sarah might navigate her own path forward. More importantly, his belief in her strength and resilience helped Sarah begin to see those qualities in herself. 2 years after the accident, Sarah stood in front of a conference room filled with medical professionals, social workers, and trauma survivors. She was giving a presentation about the psychological challenges faced by people with facial injuries, drawing from both her personal experience and the research she had conducted through her new career with the nonprofit organization. The audience listened intently as Sarah spoke about the social isolation, identity challenges, and practical difficulties that accompanied visible facial trauma. She discussed the importance of psychological support alongside medical treatment and the need for society to become more comfortable with human differences. Sarah's presentation was part of a larger conference on trauma recovery, and her talk was well received by the diverse audience. During the question and answer session that followed, several people commented on how her willingness to speak openly about her experience helped them understand aspects of trauma recovery they had never considered. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a plastic surgeon who specialized in reconstructive work for trauma patients. Dr. Rodriguez had been impressed by Sarah's insights and wanted to discuss the possibility of Sarah joining her practice as a patient advocate and counselor. The position would involve working directly with patients who were facing similar challenges to what Sarah had experienced. Her role would be to provide emotional support, practical guidance, and peer counseling to help people navigate the complex process of recovery from facial trauma. Sarah was intrigued by the opportunity. It would allow her to use her experience in a meaningful way, while also providing her with a stable career that felt purposeful and important. She had discovered that her most fulfilling moments came when she was helping others who were struggling with similar challenges. The job offer represented more than just employment. It was validation that her experience and the wisdom she had gained from it had value beyond her own personal healing. Sarah realized that her scars, which had once seemed like nothing but loss and limitation, had actually equipped her with unique qualifications for helping others. She accepted Dr. Rodriguez's offer and began working at the reconstructive surgery practice 3 months later. Her first patient was a teenage girl named Emma, who had been injured in a house fire. Emma was angry, frightened, and resistant to treatment, much as Sarah had been in the early stages of her own recovery. Working with Emma brought back many memories of Sarah's own darkest moments after the accident. She remembered the despair, the anger, and the feeling that her life as she had known it was over. However, she also brought to their sessions the perspective that could only come from having traveled the difficult path of recovery herself. Sarah's approach with patients was different from that of traditional counselors or medical professionals. She didn't offer false hope or minimize the real challenges that visible differences would create in their lives. Instead, she provided honest guidance about what they could expect and practical strategies for handling difficult situations. One of the most important Thing Sarah taught her patients was the concept that their scars were part of their story but not the entire story. She helped them understand that while their appearance had changed, their fundamental worth and potential for happiness remained intact. The work was emotionally demanding, and Sarah often found herself reliving aspects of her own trauma as she helped others process theirs. However, she also found it deeply rewarding to watch people progress from despair to acceptance to eventual empowerment. Sarah's personal life also continued to evolve during this period. She had dated occasionally since her breakup with Michael, but relationships remained challenging. Some people were put off by her appearance, while others seemed attracted to her specifically because of her scars, which felt equally uncomfortable. However, Sarah had developed a much stronger sense of self than she had possessed before the accident. She no longer defined her worth primarily through others' reactions to her appearance. This newfound confidence made her more selective about relationships but also more genuine in the connections she did make. 3 years after the accident, Sarah met David Kim at a support group meeting where she was speaking. David was a social worker who specialized in helping families cope with traumatic injuries. He had lost his left arm in a motorcycle accident several years earlier and understood the challenges of living with visible differences. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and understanding rather than just physical attraction. David appreciated Sarah's strength and resilience, while Sarah valued his empathy and his own hard-won wisdom about trauma recovery. David was the first person Sarah dated who didn't seem to notice her scars after their initial meeting. He looked at her the way Colonel Patterson had during their first conversation, seeing her as a complete person rather than focusing on the visible evidence of her trauma. Their relationship taught Sarah that it was possible to find love and acceptance even with changed appearance. More importantly, it showed her that the right person would value her for all of who she had become, including the strength and compassion she had developed through surviving her ordeal. Sarah also maintained her relationship with Colonel Patterson, who had become both a mentor and a close friend. His guidance had been instrumental in her recovery, and she continued to learn from his experience and wisdom. Their friendship was based on mutual respect and shared understanding of the challenges faced by trauma survivors. 5 years after the accident, Sarah looked back on her journey with a complex mix of emotions. She would never be grateful for the accident itself or the pain it had caused her and her loved ones. However, she had to acknowledge that the experience had taught her things about resilience, compassion, and human strength that she might never have learned otherwise. Her scars remained visible and would always be part of how the world saw her. However, they no longer felt like limitations or sources of shame. Instead, they had become symbols of survival and evidence of her ability to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Sarah's work with trauma survivors had expanded beyond her role at the medical practice. She had begun speaking at conferences and training sessions, helping medical professionals understand the psychological aspects of recovery from visible injuries. Her insights were valued by surgeons, nurses, and counselors who worked with trauma patients. The woman who had once hidden her face from the world had become someone who stood confidently in front of audiences, sharing her story in service of helping others. Her scars were visible to everyone who saw her speak, but they had become part of her message rather than something to be hidden or overcome. Sarah's story had come full circle from tragedy to triumph, though the triumph looked very different from what she might have imagined before her accident. She had not returned to her original life or appearance, but she had built something new and meaningful from the pieces that remained. In quiet moments, Sarah sometimes wondered what her life would have been like if the accident had never happened. However, these thoughts no longer filled her with regret or longing. She had learned that healing didn't mean returning to who she was before. It meant becoming someone new, someone stronger, and someone capable of helping others find their own path through darkness toward light.